Adrian Kessler stood at the gala's edge, his drink pausing midair as he locked eyes with the woman he'd come to humiliate. Serafina Vale wasn't the broken ex-lover he expected. She was a queen in black, radiating a quiet power that made his trophy wife look like a cheap imitation. As the crowd parted, Adrian's smugness turned to ice. Cashin Virely, the city's most lethal shadow, didn't just walk toward her, he claimed her. As Cashin's hand rested with dominant possession on Serafina's neck, Adrian realized with a sickening jolt that he hadn't brought a fire to the party. He had walked a lamb into a slaughterhouse. Adrian Kessler adjusted his cuffs, leading his wife Iris into the gala with a smug sense of victory. He had brought her as a trophy to sting his ex, Serafina Vale, but the plan shattered the moment he saw her. Backlit by city lights, Serafina looked magnetic and utterly unbothered, standing at the center of a world Adrian couldn't touch. As the crowd parted, the billionaire Mafia Boss Cashin vilely ignored the room to walk straight to Serafina. Years ago, Adrian had stolen her genius and left her with nothing, convinced she was a liability. Now, as Cashin claimed her with a dominant, knowing kiss, Adrian realized his mistake. The same man who had arrived ready to burn bridges now stood shivering, finally understanding that the only blood on the floor tonight would be his own. The golden light of the ballroom felt suddenly clinical, stripping away the layer of bravado Adrian had carefully applied before the mirror that evening. He stood paralyzed, his fingers digging into the stem of his champagne glass as he watched Serafina Vale. She was standing near the terrace, framed by the velvet darkness of the night sky, and she looked nothing like the woman he had discarded in a rain-slicked parking lot 3 years ago. Back then, she had been his secret weapon, the brilliant mind hidden in the shadows of his ambition. He had convinced her that her curls were too wild for boardrooms and her intellect too intimidating for investors. He had told her she needed him to be her voice, her face, her shield. When he finally cut her loose, taking her proprietary code and leaving her with a paltry settlement, he had truly believed she would wither without his light. He was wrong. Serafina didn't just shine, she glowed with a cold, nuclear frequency. She wore a black dress that moved like liquid shadow, every line of it emphasizing a confidence that didn't require his validation. Her hair was pulled back, no longer hidden, exposing a face that was serene and untouchable. She wasn't scanning the room for him. She wasn't waiting for his arrival to feel complete. In fact, as she laughed softly at something a passing diplomat said, Adrian realized with a jolt of pure terror that she had forgotten he existed. "Adrian, you're hurting my arm," Iris hissed, her voice a sharp needle popping his bubble of shock. He looked down at his wife, seeing for the first time the frantic effort in her makeup, the desperate sparkle of her rented diamonds. She was a beautiful performance, but Serafina was a force of nature. "I'm fine," he lied, his voice sounding thin even to his own ears. He tried to turn away, to retreat into the safety of the bar, but his feet were anchored. He was witnessing the impossible. The woman he had tried to bury had become the architect of a world he was barely allowed to visit. There was no resentment in her posture, no bitterness in her smile. That was the most painful part, her total indifference. He had come here to make her jealous, to prove he had won, but as Serafina turned her head, her eyes passing over him as if he were merely a piece of the furniture, Adrian felt the first true chill of the evening. He hadn't just lost a partner. He had thrown away a queen, and now he was standing in her court. The scent of expensive lilies and floor wax in the ballroom began to fade, replaced by the phantom smell of stale espresso and ozone. For a dizzying second, the tuxedo Adrian wore felt as stiff and foreign as the oversized blazer he'd bought at a thrift store 10 years ago, back when the world was a cold, empty warehouse and Serafina was the only light in it. They had started in a space that leaked when it rained, a converted industrial unit in a district the city had forgotten. Adrian could still see her hunched over a folding table, her fingers fly-typing across a cracked monitor while a single-space heater hummed a desperate tune between them. They were building Vanguard Logistics. Or rather, she was building the architecture while he sold the dream. Back then, she had been his partner in every sense, the girl who would share a single carton of noodles with him at 3 in the morning and tell him their names would one day be etched in glass. "We're almost there, Ade," she had whispered one night, her eyes bloodshot but glowing with the fire of a genius who had finally solved the impossible. She had cracked the algorithm for predictive shipping, a breakthrough that would eventually make him a millionaire. He had kissed her then, tasting the salt of their shared struggle, and promised her that once they made it, he would give her the world. But when the better deal arrived, the promise curdled into greed. A rival firm had approached him with an offer that required a clean slate. They wanted his face and her code, but they didn't want the baggage of a co-founder with a mind they couldn't control. Adrian remembered the cold calculation that had taken over his heart. He hadn't fought for her. He hadn't even hesitated. He had gone behind her back, signing the intellectual property over to a shell company he controlled, effectively locking her out of her own creation. When he finally told her, he hadn't done it in their warehouse home. He had done it in a sterile coffee shop, speaking in the detached tones of a man discussing the weather. He told her she was a liability to the brand, that her brilliance was too raw for the boardrooms he intended to conquer. The look of shattered trust in her eyes that day had haunted him for months, until he buried it under the weight of expensive cars and a lifestyle built on her stolen labor. He had convinced himself that she was a stepping stone, a necessary sacrifice for his ascent. Now, standing in the opulent glare of the Virely Gala, Adrian realized that while he had been playing with the stones he stole, Serafina had used the wreckage to build a fortress. She hadn't just survived his betrayal. She had evolved into something he no longer recognized and certainly couldn't manipulate. Iris adjusted the strap of her gown, her movements increasingly jagged as the silence from Adrian became heavy enough to choke. She had spent 2 hours in a salon chair and a month's salary on a designer label to be his centerpiece. Yet as they stood in the glow of the Virely Gala, she felt less like a queen and more like a human barrier. Every time she tried to catch Adrian's eye, seeking the validation he usually showered upon her, she found him staring past her, his gaze anchored to the woman in the black dress. "You're sweating, Adrian," she whispered, her voice tight with a dawning, bitter clarity. She reached up to pat his cheek with a manicured hand, but he flinched away, his eyes never leaving Serafina. The realization didn't hit her all at once. It bled in like ink in water. She looked at the way Adrian held her. His grip was firm, almost bruising, but there was no affection in it. He wasn't showing her off because he loved her. He was wielding her. She was the upgrade, the living proof of his supposed ascent, brought here to perform a role in a play she hadn't been cast in. She was the shield he was using to protect his fragile ego from the radiant, terrifying success of the woman he had once called a partner. "This isn't about the business deal, is it?" Iris asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous low frequency. She looked toward Serafina, seeing the effortless grace that Adrian was so desperately trying to simulate. She saw the way the men in dark suits gave Serafina space, not out of politeness, but out of a deep-seated respect. Then she looked back at Adrian, whose suit suddenly looked cheap, whose smile looked frantic, and whose desperation was starting to smell like rot. A waiter passed with a tray of crystal flutes, and Iris took one not to drink, but to have something to hold besides the arm of a man who was using her as a prop. She watched the way Serafina didn't even acknowledge their presence. To Serafina, Iris wasn't a rival, she was invisible. And to Adrian, Iris wasn't a wife, she was a distraction. The tragedy of the evening shifted. It was no longer just about Adrian's impending professional ruin. It was the quiet, brutal death of Iris's own illusions. She realized that in her quest to be the woman who had everything, she had tied herself to a man who had nothing but stolen brilliance and a pocket full of lies. As the music swelled, Iris didn't feel like a trophy anymore. She felt like a casualty of a war she hadn't known was being fought, standing beside a man who was already beginning to unravel in real time. The shift in the room was not a sound, but a sudden heavy drop in pressure. The polite hum of high society chatter didn't see so much as it redirected, like water flowing toward a drain. Adrian felt the change in the small of his back before he saw the cause. The background men, those silent, stone-faced sentinels in dark suits, stiffened in unison, creating a living corridor that carved through the center of the ballroom. Then Cashin Virely stepped into the light. He did not walk with the hurried importance of the tech moguls Adrian usually dealt with. He moved with the unhurried, terrifying grace of a predator who knew nothing in the forest could challenge him. His suit was a masterpiece of midnight wool, tailored so perfectly it seemed less like clothing and more like armor. The silver at his temples gleamed under the chandeliers, a testament to decades spent surviving wars Adrian could only imagine. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't acknowledge the nods of the politicians or the desperate, hungry eyes of the socialites. He was a man who had long ago stopped seeking approval because he had become the person who granted it. As Cashin approached the center of the floor, his presence seemed to suck the oxygen out of Adrian's lungs. There was a deliberate, lethal stillness to him. He was the calm eye of a storm that had been brewing since the moment Adrian set foot on the property. Every movement was efficient, every glance a calculation. Adrian's hand, still clutching Iris's arm, began to tremble. He had spent his life trying to look like the man Cashin actually was, but standing in the same zip code as the Mafia Boss made Adrian feel like a child playing dress-up. Cashin's gaze finally settled on the terrace, not on the bar, not on the entrance, but on Serafina. The boss's face remained a mask of iron composure, but as he drew closer to her, a faint, knowing smile touched the corners of his mouth. It wasn't a smile of surprise. It was the expression of a man who had anticipated this exact moment, this exact alignment of stars, and was now stepping forward to claim the result. He didn't say a word, yet the silence he carried was louder than any boast Adrian had ever made. The Titan had moved, and the board was now officially his. In that moment, Adrian realized that the deal he thought he was negotiating wasn't a business transaction. It was a forfeit. He was no longer a player. He was just another obstacle Cashin was about to walk right through. The heavy, rhythmic pulse of the ballroom music began to feel like a countdown. Adrian tried to swallow, but his throat was a desert of dry panic. He felt the eyes of the room shifting away from his tailored performance and toward the gravitational pull of Cashin vilely. He needed to leave, to pull Iris away and vanish into the humid city night before the trap snapped shut, but the air around him had grown dense and restrictive. Movement flickered in his peripheral vision. One of the background men, a mountain of a human with a face like etched granite and eyes that held the cold vacuum of deep space, detached himself from the shadows. He didn't rush. He didn't have to. The crowd parted for him as if by instinct, a silent acknowledgement of the lethality he carried in the simple hang of his arms. Adrian felt Iris stiffen beside him as the man stepped into their personal space, ignoring the social boundaries of the elite. He didn't look at Iris. He didn't look at the expensive watch Adrian had flashed so desperately earlier. He looked through Adrian, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that barely rose above the swell of the violins. "Mr. Kessler," the man said, the name sounding like a sentence. "Mr. Virely has noted your attendance. He finds your timing interesting." "I'm just here to enjoy the evening," Adrian managed to stammer, his hand tightening so hard on his champagne glass that the crystal groaned. "And to talk about the merger. I sent over the updated projections last week." The man's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something that might have been pity passed through his dark eyes. "Projections are for men who still have a future to project, Adrian. Right now, in the library, your debts are the only topic of conversation. Not just the money you owe the banks, but the debt you owe to the woman whose name you tried to erase." The blood drained from Adrian's face, leaving him a sickly shade of gray under the expensive lighting. The man leaned in closer, the scent of cold rain and tobacco clinging to him. "The boss doesn't like thieves, Kessler, but he hates men who use their wives as shields even more. Consider this your only warning. The bill is being tallied. Stay exactly where you are and watch how a real man settles an account." The messenger stepped back, merging into the dark wall of suits as if he had never left it. Adrian stood rooted to the spot, the champagne in his glass vibrating with the tremors in his hand. He looked at Iris, who was staring at him with a horrifying realization dawning in her eyes. The shield had been pierced, and for the first time, Adrian felt the full, freezing weight of the storm he had invited into his own life. The warning from the man in the dark suit felt like a physical weight, pressing the air from Adrian's lungs, but desperation was a powerful intoxicant. He couldn't just stand there while his life was tallied like a line item in a ledger. He needed to break the spell. He needed to see a crack in Serafina's armor, a single spark of the woman who used to cry over their shared bank balance in that drafty warehouse. Ignoring the trembling in his knees, Adrian detached himself from Iris's side. He didn't hear her muffled protest as he pushed through the crowd, his movements frantic and lacking the rhythm of the room. He reached the edge of the terrace where Serafina stood, her silhouette etched against the skyline like a monument to everything he had failed to become. "Serafina," he hissed, his voice cracking. She didn't jump, she didn't even startle. She turned slowly, her movement as fluid as oil, and looked at him. Up close, her skin glowed with a vitality that made the gala's lighting look artificial. Her eyes, once filled with a soft, desperate hope for their shared future, were now pools of deep, unbothered glass. "Adrian," she said. Her voice was a calm melody, devoid of the jagged edges of resentment he had prepared himself to face. "I see you brought a guest. She looks lovely." The compliment felt like a slap. He had come here to make her bleed with jealousy, yet she was looking at him with the polite, distant kindness one might show a stranger asking for directions. "What is this, Serafina? This? Theater?" He gestured wildly at the room, at the bodyguards, at the invisible power vibrating around her. "You think you can just walk back into this world? My world? You were a warehouse coder. I made you a founder." Serafina tilted her head slightly, a small, relaxed smile playing on her lips. She didn't lean away or tensed her shoulders. She stood her ground with a quiet, dominant energy that made Adrian feel like he was shrinking. "You didn't make me anything, Adrian," she said softly. "You simply provided the walls. I was the one who built the engine that kept them standing. And as for this world, it was never yours. You were just renting it with my intellectual property." "You're nothing without me," he snarled, though the words felt hollow even as they left his lips. "I am exactly who I was always meant to be," she countered, her composure absolute and unafraid. "The only difference is that now I'm being seen by a man who knows the difference between the architect and the salesman." She looked past him then, her eyes brightening with a warmth he hadn't seen in years. Adrian turned, his heart stopping. Cashin Virely was 10 feet away, and the look of total, unhurried possession in the Mafia Boss's eyes told Adrian that the conversation was over, and the judgment had begun. The silence that followed Serafina's words was more absolute than the music of the gala. Adrian stood paralyzed, his mouth hanging slightly open as he watched the space between them vanish. Cashin Virely stepped forward, the weight of his presence pushing the air out of the center of the terrace. He didn't look at Adrian. He didn't acknowledge the existence of the man who had spent the night trying to manufacture a reaction. Cashin's eyes were fixed solely on Serafina, and for the first time, the cold, lethal iron of his expression softened into something intimate and terrifyingly real. It was the look of a man who had finally secured the only asset that truly mattered. Adrian felt like a ghost haunting his own life as Cashin reached out. The Mafia Boss's hand moved with deliberate, quiet possession, his fingers sliding into the curls at the nape of Serafina's neck. There was no urgency in the gesture, no need to prove anything to the crowd. It was a statement of fact. Adrian watched, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs as Cashin leaned in. When Cashin kissed her, the world stopped turning for Adrian Kessler. It wasn't a kiss of desperation. It was a public coronation. As the Mafia Boss's lips met Serafina's, his wristwatch glinted subtly under the moonlight, a reminder of the wealth and control that now belonged to the woman Adrian had discarded. Serafina didn't flinch or pull away. She leaned into the embrace with a composed acceptance that signaled she had finally found her equal. Behind them, the wall of silent witnesses, the men in black suits, shifted almost imperceptibly, their unreadable faces fixed on the scene. They weren't just watching a kiss, they were witnessing a shift in the hierarchy of the city. Adrian felt the collective gaze of the elite guests fall upon him, but it wasn't the envy he had craved. It was pity mixed with a sharp social revulsion. They saw him for what he was, a man who had brought a candle to outshine the sun and ended up in the dark. Adrian's hand, still half raised as if to intervene, fell limp to his side. The ego he had meticulously built on stolen code and performative status shattered like dropped crystal. He realized in that agonizing, frozen moment that Serafina had never been the one who needed to be made jealous. He was the one who had been replaced. He had played a dangerous game with his wife as a pawn and his ex as a target, and in the end, he was the only one left with nothing. The Mafia Boss pulled back slightly, a faint, knowing smile touching his lips as he finally glanced at Adrian. It was the look a predator gives a meal it has already finished, and the realization of his total ruin finally settled into Adrian's marrow. The sound of the gala, the violins, the tinkling of ice, the low-frequency laughter of the elite, suddenly felt like a roar inside Adrian's skull. His instincts, honed by years of cutting corners and escaping consequences, finally screamed a single command: run. He needed to get Iris out of this room, to find the sanctuary of a dark street where he could begin the process of spinning this catastrophe into a misunderstanding. He turned sharply, his heels skidding slightly on the polished marble as he tried to pull Iris toward the grand staircase. But as he moved, the shadows around the perimeter of the terrace seemed to detach themselves and take shape. The background men, who had spent the night as static pillars of dark wool, shifted with a terrifying, synchronized grace. Before Adrian could take 10 steps, his path was blocked by a wall of black suits. They didn't touch him. They didn't raise their hands. They simply occupied the space he intended to take, their broad shoulders forming an impenetrable horizon. Adrian pivoted toward the side exit, but two more men stepped into his peripheral vision, their faces as unreadable and cold as tombstone granite. "Excuse me," Adrian stammered, his voice rising to an unattractive pitch. "My wife isn't feeling well. We need to leave." The man directly in front of him, the same mountain of a human who had delivered the first warning, didn't blink. He stood rooted, his arms crossed over a chest that felt as solid as an engine block. "The show isn't over, Mr. Kessler," the man said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to rattle Adrian's teeth. "And the boss doesn't like it when guests leave before the final act." Adrian felt Iris's weight sagging against his arm, her breathing shallow and panicked. He turned back toward the center of the terrace, looking for a gap, but the wall of silent witnesses had tightened their circle. They weren't just blocking his exit. They were a living frame, forcing his gaze back toward the epicenter of his ruin. He was trapped. He was forced to stand in the glare of the chandeliers, a prisoner of his own failed ambition, while the most powerful people in the city watched him disintegrate. Every eye in the room was now a witness to his cowardice, a silent jury judging the man who had tried to play a god and ended up a jester. There was no escape, no dark corner to hide in. He had to stand there, stripped of his dignity and his lies, and watch as Serafina and Cashin vilely walked through the wreckage of the life he had stolen. The wall of suits was more than a physical barrier. It was the finality of a world that was officially closing its doors to him forever. The golden luster of the ballroom had turned into a cold, fluorescent glare in Adrian's eyes. He stood trapped within the circle of silent men, his chest heaving as the reality of his calculation finally balanced to zero. Across the terrace, Cashin vilely finally broke the kiss, his hand lingering at the base of Serafina's skull for a heartbeat longer, a gesture of finality. Then the Titan turned his gaze toward Adrian. It wasn't a look of anger. It was the look of a mathematician correcting a decimal point. "The merger you proposed, Adrian," Cashin's voice was smooth, carrying effortlessly across the silent crowd. "It was never about growth. It was a desperate attempt to use Serafina's remaining patents to cover the $30 million hole in your offshore accounts. You didn't come here to make her jealous. You came here to steal from her one last time." A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers, but the sharpest sound was the sharp intake of breath from the woman at Adrian's side. Iris stepped back, her hand falling away from his arm as if his very skin had turned to ash. "$30 million?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a terrifying mix of realization and disgust. She looked at the husband she thought she knew, seeing past the tailored suit to the hollow, panicked shell beneath. "You didn't bring me here because you loved me. You brought me here to distract them while you tried to sell her soul again." "Iris, listen." Adrian reached for her, but she recoiled, her eyes filling with a cold, crystalline hate. "Don't touch me," she spat. "You're not a mogul, Adrian, you're a parasite." She turned and walked toward the wall of dark suits. Surprisingly, the men stepped aside for her, allowing her to pass through the perimeter. She didn't look back. She left him standing alone in the center of the trap, stripped of his shield, his trophy, and his lies. Cashin stepped forward, the glint of his gold watch catching the light, a ticking clock marking the end of Adrian's time. "Your debt is no longer financial, Mr. Kessler. You've defaulted on everything that makes a man worth keeping alive. The patents have been reverted, the accounts are frozen, and the warehouse you started in, it's been bought and demolished." Adrian looked at Serafina. He searched for a flicker of the girl who used to share his coffee, but she was gone. In her place stood a woman who had outgrown his shadow. She didn't say a word, she didn't have to. Her silence was the final calculation. He had lost the business, he had lost his name, and as he looked at the empty space where his wife had stood, he realized he had finally lost himself. The bill was due, and Adrian Kessler was bankrupt in every way that mattered. The silence that followed the collapse of Adrian Kessler's world was more than a lack of sound. It was a profound lesson in the mechanics of power and the fragility of a life built on shadows. As the crowd dispersed, and the music faded into the hum of the city, the ruins of the evening stood as a testament to a fundamental truth. In a world of wolves, loyalty is the only currency that never devalues. Adrian had spent his career believing that success was a product of clever manipulation and stolen brilliance. But he learned too late that while gold can buy a seat at the table, only integrity keeps you from becoming the meal. The weight of words is not measured by how loudly they are spoken, but by the honor behind them. Adrian's promises were hollow shells, designed to mirror the commitment he never felt. He had viewed his wife and his former partner as pawns in a grand game of psychological chess, forgetting that when you use people as tools, you eventually find yourself in a world where no one is left to hold your hand when the storm breaks. Using those closest to you as shields does not protect you. It only ensures that when the shield finally falls, you are left utterly exposed to the consequences of your own deception. There is a distinct, lethal difference between power and performance. Adrian was a man of performance. His expensive suits, his rented diamonds, and his manufactured dramas were all loud attempts to convince the world of a status he hadn't earned. True authority, embodied by Cassian Virely, is silent. It does not need to roar to be felt. It does not need to perform to be recognized. Those who are truly powerful move with a deliberate, unbothered composure, knowing that their value is intrinsic and their reach is absolute. Ultimately, the story of the warehouse coder who became a queen and the mogul who became a ghost serves as a reminder that the architecture of a person's character is their only true defense. You cannot build a fortress out of lies and expect it to withstand the truth. When the lights of the gala finally dimmed, the educational value was clear. Real status is not found in who you can make jealous, but in who you can make trust you. Adrian Kessler walked into the night alone, finally understanding that the most expensive thing he ever threw away wasn't a business or a patent. It was his own soul.